All right, welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to talk a little bit more about working with images. Now, we've seen quite a few examples of the image element already, and we know that IMG is used to embed image content. We've seen that a bunch. Here we have a brief recap for you. We've got the IMG element with a source attribute pointing to where the image exists, and then the alt attribute. Now, it's worth noting that the alt attribute is required as alternative text for the image, but if the image in question is actually more presentational, but it doesn't make sense to include it using a style or something like that, then you can use an empty alt attribute as you see here. So alt equals and then empty quotes. The reason to do this, apart from being concerned about having a valid HTML document, is that a screen reader, when it comes to an image, will actually read out the word image if there is no alt text. If the alt text is empty, it will simply skip over it. If there is alt text, it will read the alternative text instead of reading the word image. Now, when using images, it's really important for you to choose the best and most appropriate image type for each context. So for instance, if you have something that's a photo or has a lot of color gradients and doesn't require transparency, a JPEG may be the most appropriate image format for you to use because of the way it compresses the image down. If, however, you have something with solid blocks of color that requires just some binary transparency, in other words, either fully transparent or fully opaque, then perhaps a GIF is the way to go. Another option would be an 8-bit PNG, which is like a GIF but has a little bit better compression. Or if you need to have alpha transparency, in other words, you need transparency that is not simply on or off, but actually is graded, then you might want to look at using a 24-bit PNG. They're really good for photos and gradients, but they can be a bit larger than a JPEG. A newer format that we're starting to see is WebP. Not all browsers support it, but it's like a 24-bit PNG, but it's a little bit smaller file size. Now, if you're using Photoshop as your photo editor, you can actually choose how you export the photos and look at the various ways that it compresses them down. You do that by choosing Save for Web, and then it'll give you a 4-up grid of different images, and you can choose the different image formats and see how big they are in terms of file size, as well as how long they would take to download over particular speeds of connection. This can be really useful when trying to figure out the best way to save the image. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, you can see that the JPEG compresses a bit smaller, and I can even adjust the quality to be a little bit better in order to make the image look sharper. Now in the lower right-hand corner, I can turn it into a GIF, and that GIF is going to be a little bit more pixely because it only has a limited number of colors available to it, and because it's a photo, it's going to be a little bit bigger than a JPEG is, but both of them are a lot smaller than the 24-bit PNG is. There are a lot of settings that you can adjust within Photoshop in order to figure out the best possible solution. After all the tweaking, it looks like the JPEG is the best choice at 21.84K, and it'll only take 9 seconds to download even over a 28.8 kilobits per second connection. Now, if you want to be able to export the WebP format, there is an option for that. You can download an exporter from telegraphics.com.au, and you'll be able to export directly from Photoshop into the WebP format. But just, again, be aware that WebP is not universally supported at this time, so it may not be the optimum image format to use right now. Web designer Jen Lucas has put together an amazing talk available at this URL that you should take a look at because it goes into the various implications when dealing with images, both standardly and within a responsive context. I highly recommend that you check it out. Now, earlier on in this lesson, I mentioned that HTML as a language has continued to evolve and that it has mechanisms that allow it to continue to evolve. Now, each of the different specs evolves over a different time period. So HTML is sometimes slower, sometimes faster, CSS runs on its own track, JavaScript on its own track. Everything doesn't move in lockstep, it kind of moves at its own pace, but each of these languages continues to evolve. And so As part of that evolution, we've had the creation of adaptive images, which are for use within a responsive context. So here we have a standard way of embedding an image. Well, as part of the picture spec for responsive images within HTML5, we can define more options that apply in different contexts. So first we have the source attribute, which is the default. It's the fallback. Browsers that are older, that don't understand the new attributes from HTML5, will ignore those attributes because browsers ignore what they don't understand, and they'll only see the SRC, the source attribute, and use that image. So we want to choose the smallest image for that. So here you see images/cuttlefish-sm for small cuttlefish, and then .jpg. The next attribute we have is the source set attribute, and what the source set attribute lets us do is define multiple images for use in different contexts. So you start with the URL for the image, followed by a space, and then the width that that image is. So in this case, cuttlefish.jpg is 800 pixels wide. So I say images/cuttlefish.jpg space 800W. And then I can define an alternate image by putting the comma in there and saying images/cuttlefish-sm.jpg 400W because it's 400 pixels wide. With these instructions, a browser will choose the most appropriate image given the available screen real estate. Now I can further define how these images should be chosen using the sizes attribute. With sizes, I can actually use a media query, and we'll talk a bit more about media queries in the CSS lessons, but I can use a media query and say that when there's a minimum width of 800 pixels, the image will be displayed at 400 pixels wide. Otherwise, it will be at 50%. So that's basically what that little bit inside of the sizes means. And what that does is it provides a set of instructions to the browser to inform it how the image is going to be used so that the browser can make the most appropriate decision as to which image should be loaded in which context. So I'm going to hop over to the browser really quick just to show you a video of how this ends up working. Here we see we've got the image with the cuttlefish small JPEG in it. And then I'm going to slowly increase the width of the browser, and you'll see that it'll swap out which image is being used. So now you see it has switched from cuttlefish small to simply cuttlefish.jpg. So, and if you mouse over it, you can see that the natural size is 800 by 625, but it's only being displayed at 120 by 94. Now the reason that it's using this higher resolution image is that I'm actually capturing this on a Retina MacBook Pro. So the higher resolution screen is recognized by the browser and it swaps in the most appropriate image given the context. Now I mentioned that source set and sizes are part of the picture spec. The picture spec actually came out of the development of the picture element, which is used similarly to source set and sizes, but specifically for art direction of images. Here we see a sample picture element. We have the actual containing element, the opening and closing picture tags. And then within that, we have multiple sources that are available to us. And each of those contain their own source sets. So you could have multiple different resolutions in here, and then a media query that's associated with them. So you could even define an image specifically for print if you wanted to. And the way that picture works is that the browser will choose the first image that matches the given context. So you start with the largest one first. In this case, if the minimum width is 40 ems. In the case of the second one, if the minimum width is 20 ems. And then the third one is simply the default source that should be used by the picture element, which is the small version. And then last but not least, you'll notice we've got an image element in there. This is actually a requirement. And this is the fallback because, as I've said multiple times, browsers ignore what they don't understand. So that image element becomes a fallback. If the browser understands the picture element, the image gets ignored. But if the browser does not understand the picture element, then that image element actually gets exposed and the picture element's ignored. All right, so this wraps up this chapter. And in this chapter, we talked about images, image formats, and the like. And we also talked about using images in responsive contexts. And we'll talk more about responsive design in the CSS lessons. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about other media, specifically audio and video.